Hi, good afternoon. This is Phil Edwards coming to my awesome class, who is my interpersonal communication class. And currently, we don't have a class this week due to the coronavirus. However, I would still like to make sure that you get a message, so I'll be covering chapter 8 in this awesome documentary. Really briefly, chapter 8 starts on page 165, and all the learning objectives are here. Unfortunately, you're not in class with me today, so the dialogue that we normally go back and forth and all the examples, we will have much less of that, obviously, because I'm in a room all by myself. So on page 166, the principles of conversation, this will follow you into your final exam. And these 5 steps are very important. It happens in every single conversation. It starts off with an opening, and at the opening conversation, it's a hey, hi, how are you? Followed by some feed forward. We talked about feed forward in previous chapters. And in feed forward, it's me basically saying to you, you know what, there's something that I really got to tell you. It's kind of like a tone setting. You'll get an idea if this is a business meeting, is this a personal conversation, does this have to do with sports, relationships, or whatever. And then next comes the business. And that's the actual things that we'll be talking about, which is followed by some feedback, kind of wrapping up what you thought about what we spoke about, seeing if you liked it, didn't like it, checking in on how you're feeling, and then the final stage is the closing stage. That's how we say goodbye, whether we're leaving happy, whether we're leaving disappointed. But that's the 5 steps of every conversation. And why it's such an important component to conversation messages, if I'm lacking some of those steps, so let's just suppose, say for example, I wanted to tell you that I needed you to become the Prime Minister of Canada. And all I said was, hi, how are you? And then I said, I need you to be the Prime Minister. And I jumped right to the business. I didn't get a chance to feed forward to see how you're doing, check in with you. And if I left the conversation there, didn't do any feedback, didn't do any closing, I don't really know where we stand. And so all 5 steps are necessary. And this is very good in personal relationships, business relationships, you name it. So we're going to turn the page. And we're going to talk about the principles of dialogue. So here we talk about different types of conversation. And at times we're having a dialogue conversation in which there is a speaker and a listener, very similar to how we do when we're in class. And sometimes in life there's going to be a monologue conversation in which one person speaks. And the challenge in life is at times you'll go somewhere and you really want to give some input, you really want to give some feedback, but if you're in a monologue setting, it's not an appropriate time for you to speak. And so if you went to a lecture or you're at a religious ceremony of some sort, it's important to know where you are. Some religious settings allow you to have a dialogue with the person up front, very much like our classroom. And in some settings, there is no dialogue whatsoever, which is seen as a monologue. So the person who is controlling the conversation will be speaking the entire time, and everyone else's job is to just listen. I often use this example if I'm crossing the border. The person who is driving does the dialogue with the crossing guard or the sheriff. And everyone else is literally in the car in monologue mode. I don't need you to speak from the back saying, you know, we're going to Tennessee, and someone else says, no, we're going to Texas. All these noise and confusion, monologue for me is the best version when crossing the border or speaking to anyone of authority. On page 170, we have a lot of things that I'm actually missing out on today because nobody's here with me in the classroom. But these are some skills that we require when we're having a conversation. So there are speakers cues. This normally takes place as I'm speaking. Some turn maintaining cues. So if you're nodding your head and I can tell that you're paying some attention to me, and these are some turn yielding cues, like when people yawn or someone's going, ooh. These are ways that the speaker realizes that, well, maybe I need to change the subject, or maybe I need to change my voice a little bit. And there's also listener cues. So it lets the speaker know when you'd like your turn to speak. So if you're listening to me and I see that you're at the edge of your seat and you're leaning forward because you really want to say something, those are some listener cues. There's also back channeling cues, and with back channeling cues, it's kind of like the communication of various types of information that you give back to the speaker without assuming the role of the speaker. So once again, in a lot of religious settings, the speaker is speaking and the congregation chimes in. Perhaps they're saying amen or continue to speak. Keep on speaking, brother. Those are the type of back channeling cues that shows that people are supportive of what you're saying. We also have interruptions. And so while I'm speaking, oftentimes you can have people from the audience who are constantly challenging or interrupting the speaker. And this is also another form of conversation message. That's somebody's way in the audience of saying that they'll perhaps don't agree with what I'm saying, or perhaps they're challenging my legitimacy, and so they're going to interrupt and find ways for me to prove that I'm not just regurgitating information, but I actually know what I'm speaking about. Page 171 also talks about the principles of politeness. Now, politeness, as Canadians, is often a skill that we use throughout the world and used in many other cultures as well. And the challenge of politeness, it doesn't exist in every culture. And so let's pretend, for example, there's a job interview and I have to give someone some bad news that they didn't get the job. If I'm coming from a lens of politeness, even though I'm giving bad news, it might be a struggle for me. And so I may struggle to tell someone that they're fired, or I may struggle to tell someone that they failed a class because I am so polite. And I've often had colleagues of mine who haven't been able to advance in their jobs because they do struggle to do disciplinary actions towards their colleagues or coworkers. And so the principle of politeness, what I enjoy about it, even if I have to give you bad news, whether it's a breakup or whether you're being dismissed from a job or whether you didn't pass your exam, I can still tell you positive things even in a negative situation. And that's part of the principle of politeness. You don't have to give bad news and be a bad person at the same time. We're turning the page over to 172 is just some more examples. Jumping over here to page 173, a very important component that will be on your final exam, even though it's just two small words. And it's the conversation of disclosure and how and when to reveal yourself. So self-disclosure refers to communicating information about yourself, usually from the hidden, we talked about that in previous chapters, to another person, and it may involve information about your values, beliefs, and desires. So what's powerful about self-disclosure is oftentimes I'm the worker and I've got a client in my office, and perhaps that client is sharing with me their story of trauma, of pain, or whatever it might be. And as humans, we almost have an automatic tendency to want to self-disclose. Now, the challenge we have in our field is when you choose to self-disclose, you may also be showing perhaps that you are, and I don't want to say that you're in an unprofessional manner, but when you do start to self-disclose, that can be used against you. So let's use an example of if I've got a client coming to me saying that they perhaps used to use drugs or alcohol or cheated on their spouse or whatever it is, and I start saying, oh, I did all the same as well, and now that can be turned against me. Because oftentimes a client right now might be my friend, but later on if I have to go into my no mode or I have to deprive them of something that they're seeking, suddenly now, because I self-disclosed, they can say, oh, Phil's a former alcoholic or a former crack addict or whatever it might be. And now that I've self-disclosed those things to them, it could come against me. And the same thing in the workplace. If I tell my supervisor that, I'm having a hard time at home with situations, or I've got this happening, and now maybe I'm not going to get promoted because I disclosed too much information. So we have to be cautious what we disclose and to whom we disclose. And just because someone discloses to you doesn't mean that you have to disclose to them. So there are influences on page 174 as to who and why we choose to self-disclose. And these information is clear right here. It could be based on your personality. Maybe you just love to share and tell everybody things that are happening in your life or in your day. Perhaps culturally, you choose to disclose or you don't choose to disclose. All the information are here. We talked about these things, whether it's your gender, who the audience is. I may want to disclose if I'm talking to a sports group more than I would if I were talking to a group that doesn't like sports. And of course, we're here talking about interpersonal communication. And so our level of similarities and likeness will want me to disclose more to you because I see that you're so interested and you're probably sitting at home right now saying, wow, I love this video. And it makes me want to disclose even more to you. The topic, we are talking about interpersonal communication, and all my students know how passionate I am about this class. And so it makes me want to share personal stories about myself. But if we weren't talking about interpersonal communication, I would be less likely to self-disclose because it's not a topic that is relevant to everyone. And of course, this term, the medium here, it refers to where we are. So oftentimes you may disclose if you're in a setting where you're comfortable or an environment where it's set up for people to disclose, such as small circles or therapy or group talks. Rewards and dangers of self-disclosure. If we can focus here on the text for a second, please. This right here will definitely be on your exam. And some of the rewards for self-disclosing, I kind of briefly touched on this, but it's when you have a trusting relationship. So the more open you get with someone that you trust, the relationship can start to grow, the bond starts to get thicker, and there are also dangers of those self-disclosures. It's also perhaps either when that trust hasn't been established yet, or that trust has now faded. So imagine if you gave all of yourself to someone, you told them everything about you, and now that relationship has faded, or that person isn't trustworthy, and they're taking all your personal stuff to the lunchroom at work. And so the dangers of self-disclosing, once again, is you put everything out there into someone or a group of people, and now everything could be known to others. Page 176 starts to talk about the guidelines for self-disclosure. And this is some pretty easy reading material, and we've talked about this. The guidelines include, be careful of disclosing things that aren't ready to be talked about. And some of this information here is very relevant for your project that you're going to be working on, your personal timelines. I don't need to know everything about you, I just need to know what's relevant in your life and what's relevant from the textbook. There are guidelines also for facilitating and responding to self-disclosure, and this is some pretty cool tools as well. So the skill of effective listening and active listening, please pay attention when someone is self-disclosing. If someone is disclosing to you personal information and you start falling asleep, that's not a good thing. Guilty, guilty, guilty. You have to support and reinforce the individual as well. So one of the worst things we can do, somebody opens up, tells you all about their life, and then you just tell them to move on as if they're just an employee number or a client number. Have some support and resources, because when people do disclose, they tend to be going into a place that is very challenging and may need some support. The point here of talking about be willing to reciprocate means that you should be able to share if necessary, but it's not a must. And so reciprocity is you give and take as well as I give and take. But that's not always the case with self-disclosure. We're going to turn to page 177, where it talks about small talk. And I'm going to pause right here for a second, because small talk is very, very important. Sometimes we get caught up in these conversations where we're having a dialogue and someone says something horrible about someone, and I respond back. And so whether it's the instructor, Phil, whether it's Phil at his day job, whether it's Phil the father, Phil in the relationship, I've got to be cautious of what I say and who I speak to, because small talk is getting a lot of people in trouble. Whether it's through the Me Too movement, whether it's talking bad about someone's culture or their rights or their gender, small talk can get people in a lot of trouble, which is why I'm here to warn you, be cautious of your small talk. There's a lot of people who are recording, there are a lot of things that go viral, and so even the examples that I share in class, I'm always cautious of them, once again, because small talk, I could say one small thing that could offend someone, and that could go to many different channels throughout the world. So we gotta be careful with your small talk. On page 179, we're gonna start learning about some tips for conversation messages. And so page 178 has a table on table 8.2. And these are some general ways to help you with your language, some general ways of speaking and some specific ways of speaking. And there's also a little test on page 179. And I told you from the beginning of the course, these tests are more for you and your personal self. But how do you small talk? And that's what this test is called. Very good little tips that you can try and with yourself or with your family members. But the tips on page 179 start sharing information about how to be positive in your small talk. Another example would be sensitive to taking cues. So it's important that you always turn take and let someone else have the opportunity. Even when we're in this classroom setting, I like to hear different voices from different people speaking, because I'm not only speaking to one student, I'm speaking to all of you, and it's good to have that opportunity as well. On page 180, the concept of introducing people. Now, this is not exam content, but it's actually a very good skill in this world of conversation. And so let's pretend that my great friend, Doug Ford, walked into the classroom right now, And whether you're a fan of his or not, I would be introducing him in a way that edifies him and his position and the work and the caliber of things that he can do. And so it's very important to not just say, Doug Ford is coming into class today. Part of introducing people is showing their worth, the appreciation, and there's a list of all these attributes that you can do when introducing people. One of the greatest feelings is when you go somewhere and someone introduces you to the room, because oftentimes it would look very egotistical if I introduced myself and I spoke of all the great things that I've done. And so when it's done by someone else, the audience actually appreciates it a lot more. Page 181. We're going to talk about apologies. Now, an apology, especially when we're growing up as children, our parents said if two children are fighting or playing wrong or said something wrong, number one, we're always told to go and apologize. And what did that apology sound like? I don't know about for you, but for me it was like, fine, I'm sorry. Because I really wanted to just get back to my activities. And so even as adults, one of the things we focus on really isn't the apology, it's really more focusing on, okay, so what happens if this happens the next time? And so part of the apology list here in the text, it's talking about to admitting that you were wrongdoing, to be apologetic. It also likes to emphasize the importance of be specific on what you're apologizing about. There's nothing worse than being the person in the relationship that's constantly saying, I'm sorry, my bad, I'm sorry. So if you're going to show an apology, it's important to state what you're apologizing about and give the assurance. I like the point here that's being stated. Give the assurance that it won't reoccur. That's one of the most genuine things you can do in relationships, at work, you name it. Look to fix it, and don't fix it because you've offended the other person. Fix it because you're sincere that it needs to be fixed. Because if you're only fixing it to please the other person, as soon as you no longer have to please that person, you might resort back to your old ways. And so if you're going to use the words, I'm sorry, or that you're apologizing, aim to apologize sincerely. On page 183, the head topic here is complimenting. So when you compliment someone, it's also very important that you compliment sincerely. These are different ways to compliment folks. Now, if I were to compliment someone and every time I said, you look so lovely, and then I said, your exam, you did such a lovely job, and then you've got a car, and I'm like, oh, that's such a lovely car. You start to water down the effects of the compliments. And so it's very important, and I wrote here in my notes on the textbook here, I've Googled it before. It's a little thing that says 100 ways or 96 ways to say good job. If you're giving compliments, especially for those who are parents in the room or those who are in relationships, alter the way you say good job. Alter the way you say thank you. Alter the way you say I love you. And what it really does is it changes the effect of it, because there are different degrees to saying good job or thank you or I love you. And it just diversifies your vocabulary. So there are challenges when giving compliments. And oftentimes if I gave you a compliment, but I didn't give you a compliment, now the people in the room start worrying about compliments. And sometimes we have to focus our compliment on the duty and the action of the person and not the physical attributes of someone. So an example of that would be if someone really was looking really good, they put themselves together today, my compliment to them would be, it looks like you really put some good efforts into your outfit. It's not me saying, wow, that outfit looks really good on you, because it's more, it could be perceived as a crush or a liking, and we don't want to give that image. So we talk about the person's efforts, ask them how they felt. How does it feel when you do your hair that way? And it's them giving themselves a compliment, not necessarily me giving them a compliment. Also, receiving compliments, it could be a challenge. So sometimes someone may say, wow, nice haircut, or, you know, you really look good today, and sometimes receiving a compliment might be awkward. And so you're gonna have to have your own skills and ways to how to receive compliments. I normally just say, you know what, I'm just trying to be healthy inside and on the outside as well, versus just focusing on the outer shell, because sometimes those vanities can become very complicated. I also don't like to give compliments, because if I give a compliment today, well, what happens to the person tomorrow? And they may say, wow, maybe they made a difference that I didn't notice, and all of a sudden now I get caught up in this always giving compliments, which actually waters down the compliments. I really like this section here on page 184. It's the topic of giving advice. And so advice is the process of giving another person a suggestion for thinking or behaving, and is usually used to change his or her way of thinking. What I normally do when I give advice, if someone came to me with a problem, Phil, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, blah, 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 before I even give advice and before I even offer any type of a suggestion, I ask them what they want. So the first thing I might say is, would you like to just vent? Is that what you need just to get it off your chest? I won't even challenge you. I have nothing more to say. I'm just hearing, listening. The second thing I might ask them is, do they need shared experience? So, hey, you went through a job loss and you're sharing that with me, and now I will share with you how it felt when I went through a job loss. And that's a back and forth conversation. The third thing they might need is a challenge. So let's pretend the topic was job loss. If they need to be challenged, my role in this advice giving would be, okay, here I'm going to challenge you. I want you to have your resume ready in the next 3 days. I want you to, on average, send your resume to 5 different jobs every day. And so I'm going to challenge them while they're in their struggle. Once again, the best thing about advice, it's not what I need, it's what the person needs, which is why I tend to ask people, what is it that you're seeking in this moment? This pretty much kind of wraps up our conversation messages. This is chapter 8. I can't wait to see you when we focus on chapter 9. Have yourself a great day, and please make sure you do your reading.